didn't see you there. It's Aston with MotoTune. I'm here to talk about taking apart a Vespa ET2 carburetor and putting it back together again. So at this point, you should have the carburetor already removed from your motorcycle. The throttle cable should be removed. You should still have the choke mechanism attached to the carburetor. If you went ahead and removed it, that's not a huge issue. It's just going to be a pain in the ass to reinstall. So this right here is the auto choke mechanism that I'm tapping on right there. Right here is the auto choke plug. Again, this should already be removed and your choke should be attached to your carburetor. Here is your throttle cable elbow. That throttle cable elbow should already be removed from the carburetor if you've removed your carburetor from your bike. This is the airbox side of the carburetor. That is the big side of the carburetor. The small side of the carburetor goes into the intake manifold. First step is grab some tools. Fortunately, it only takes 2 tools to disassemble this carburetor. I'm going to start with a flathead screwdriver that's attached to a multi-tool. We're going to loosen the float bowl screws. However, I'm going to leave these float bowl screws attached because I still have not removed the throttle slide. So now I'm going to grab my Phillips head screwdriver and remove the screw, keeping the throttle elbow in the carburetor. There is a spring and a slide underneath this mechanism. If your carburetor is already off of the motorcycle, then your throttle cable should be removed and this slide right here should be attached to it. You can go ahead and let that hang off of the side of your bike. You shouldn't need to touch it except for maybe cleaning off the slide needle, which is that sharp pointy thing poking through the middle of the slide. I'm just playing with it here. It'll give you kind of a reference for putting it all back together again. So this is the needle keeper. It has a little nubbin on the top of it that fits into a hole on the slide. You will make sure that all of this goes back together properly when you reinstall it. This is the slide needle. It fits into the slide. And then this is the little needle keeper again. So the way all of this fits together, again, you can remove the carburetor without disassembling any of this stuff. It just hangs there on the side of your bike. But for now, we're going to remove the auto choke. It is held on with 2 Phillips head screws. Once you remove those screws, the auto choke will fall out. So I'm kind of cheating here a little bit. I'm using a brand new carburetor that is fresh out of the box to do this disassembly and reassembly video. It needs to be said that if you're working on a dirty carburetor, one that hasn't been removed from the bike in a long time, or especially if it's been sitting for a really long time, all of these screws, all of these parts can get seized inside of their holes and be extremely difficult to remove. So now we're going to remove the float bowl after I've removed all of the stuff from the top. I'm using this multi-tool with a flathead screwdriver attachment. That's probably not the best way to do it, although flathead screwdrivers ought to be illegal. They're bullshit. They just slip side to side and they slide out from where they're supposed to be. You can see me being pretty careful unscrewing the screw that attaches the float bowl to the carburetor body. If you're using an actual flathead screwdriver, it's a lot easier. It goes a lot faster. Again, I was just lazy because I didn't want to go out to my garage and grab real tools, so I decided to use a bicycle multi-tool that I had laying around along with a Phillips head screwdriver that I keep in my junk drawer. Again, it doesn't take a lot of tools to disassemble one of these carburetors. It's not that hard. So follow along with me and we'll see if we can get you to where you want to go. Once you have the float bowl off, it's time to look at the main jet. That's the thing I'm pointing at here. The pilot jet's right there, but the float is this white thing that I'm moving around. And then we have the float needle, which is hidden under this piece of metal underneath the float, and then the float pin, which holds all of this together. Float pins can be a pain in the ass to remove. Some of them are actually press fitted in from one side, and you will need to use an automatic center punch to punch it out. But this one is loosely fitted, so I'm going to use the small end of an Allen key that's attached to this bicycle multi-tool that I have, and I'm just going to push it out from whichever side is convenient. So that side didn't seem like the best side to go in from, so I'm going to try the other side, and now we will push the pin right out, push it halfway out, and then pull it the rest of the way out with my fingers. Once I do that, I can pull the float out with the float needle attached to the float. All of this is going to stay attached. So here is the float needle. You can see it there hanging on to the float. The rubber tip on the end of it, you'll need to pay close attention to that. Any kind of cracking, swelling, dry rot, wear, you need to replace the float needle. The float needle fits into a seat, which is this hole that I'm pointing at there. So that hole, which is between the 2 little, you could call them towers, that the float pin goes into, That hole right between there is where the float needle sits into, and it needs to be perfectly smooth in order to get a good seal against your fuel tank. Once you have the float and needle removed, it's time to remove the main jet and the pilot jet. It needs to be said again, I'm working on a brand new carburetor, so this thing has not had decades of ethanol attacking it. It hasn't had years and years of sitting around, just gumming it up. Here you can see me fumbling my multi-tool trying to remove the pilot jet. So with these brand new carburetors, these Chinese replacement carburetors, it's not guaranteed that all the parts are going to fit together properly or even normally. So here you can see I popped the pilot jet out. There we go. I had to remove it half a screw at a time because somebody didn't know how to cut threads in China. So here it is, the pilot jet and the main jet in the palm of my hand. The main jet's the big one, the pilot jet's the tiny one. So here's the big jet, the main jet. That's the one that feeds the bike fuel whenever you are off of idle. So when you open the throttle, that's where it's getting its fuel from. When it's just idling, this is where it gets its fuel from. It gets its fuel from the pilot jet, which is the little jet. That's the jet that feeds it fuel when it's just idling. So if that jet gets plugged up, your bike won't start, it won't idle properly, it won't run properly. Your best bet to unplug the pilot jet if it's gotten plugged up is to strip a piece of electrical wire and use a copper strand. Run that through the middle of it. But in the meantime, you're looking at the needle and the float. So the needle fits onto the float, and then all of that fits into the carb body. And then there's this needle plunger. So that needle plunger has to move freely in order for the carburetor to work properly. And that's it. It's time to reassemble this thing. But we're going to go back to what I was just talking about, which is that the pilot jet is usually the first one to get plugged up, and you'll need to use a piece of copper wire in order to clean it out. It's also hugely recommended. The only way that I clean carburetors is with an ultrasonic cleaner. So at this point, before you start reassembling it, and I've already put the main jet back in, so we've already started reassembling it, but this would be the time that you would want to dunk all of the parts inside of an ultrasonic cleaner and clean the snot out of any kind of dirty carburetor that you've removed from some bike that's been sitting on the side of someone's house for the past 10 fucking years. For now, though, I'm going to show you a trick that, in my opinion, you owe me money for showing you. It's really, it's that useful. So the fuel needle from before, that little part with the little rubber tip on it, you can see it right underneath my index finger there, right underneath the multi-tool. It's hanging out right there in the field of view here on this camera. That thing, if you soak it in two-stroke oil, it is significantly more likely to seal up the way that it should. So here you can see I've got some two-stroke oil. I went ahead and poured it into the cap, and now I'm going to take the fuel needle and I'm going to throw it in that two-stroke oil, and I'm going to shake it around, and then I'm going to let it sit there. I'm going to let it sit there while I do other things. Your carb body might be in an ultrasonic cleaner right now. That's the perfect time to let this thing soak. After you've soaked the fuel needle in some two-stroke oil for 5 or 10 minutes, it'll be time to fit it back onto the float. And then you can take the float with the needle hanging off of it, and you can slide that right back into the seat, right back where it needs to go. And then you will put the float pin in through the most convenient side. That's the side with the fewest obstructions. When the float pin slides through, you're pretty much good to go. But there is another thing that's a good thing to check, which is the float height. You can see me banging on the float there a little bit, but we're going to look at the float height before we put this bowl back on. So on most carburetors, it's going to be, so that top part of the float that I'm pressing on there, that should be parallel with the surface that the float fits onto. But this one isn't really adjustable in any kind of way, shape, or form, so your best bet would be to just fit it as is and see how it works on the bike. Before fitting the float bowl back onto the carb body, it's a good idea to have a good look at the float bowl O-ring. That's the little O-ring or gasket, the rubber seal that's fitted into the float bowl. It needs to have a nice round shape to it. If it's flattened out, then it's a good idea to replace it. If it shows any signs of dry rotting or cracking, also a good idea to replace it. If it's still in good shape, go ahead and apply some two-stroke oil to the rubber O-ring. And then after you've applied some two-stroke oil, you can go ahead and refit the float bowl to the carburetor body. I'm going to repeat this because it bears repeating. At this point, your throttle slide should be hanging off of your throttle cable with your throttle elbow still attached with the spring and the keeper and the slide needle. All of that should still be attached to your throttle cable over there on your scooter. There's generally no need to take the slide off of the throttle cable. You can clean it as much as it needs to be cleaned right there, still attached to the throttle cable. It does not have to be perfect, just get all of the junk and corrosion off of the slide needle and you will be in good shape. I haven't said it yet, but this is one of the simplest carburetors that you could ask to work on. There's only so many things underneath the float bowl, and the throttle cable comes off before you even remove the carburetor from the bike. So all you're left with once the carburetor is off the bike is the stuff that's underneath the float bowl. And the only things that are underneath the float bowl that you need to worry about are that fuel needle, the float pin, the pilot jet, and the main jet. That's the only thing that's underneath there. Other than that, there's the O-ring that's attached to the float bowl, but as long as that's in good shape and you clean everything else out, your bike should run pretty halfway decent after you clean all of this stuff out. I cleaned one of these carburetors on site at a customer's house using nothing but brake clean and carburetor cleaner, and as far as I know that bike still works because I haven't gotten a message saying that it stopped working yet. So these carburetors, they're very, very simple. Here I'm showing you the slide. This is the idle screw side. That's the other side. We're looking at the other side. Now here's the idle screw slide again. So as long as you have all of that clocked properly, there's the idle screw on the actual carb body. You can see it poking through inside this hole. On the other side, there's a slot that you can kind of see there. I'd throw an arrow up or something here, but I have no idea how to do that yet. Once you get the slide clocked properly, it will slide right in, and then you can reattach the top cap using the Phillips head screw that you removed as you were removing the carburetor from the motorcycle. The last step here is to reattach the auto choke mechanism to the bike. It's pretty easy. However, if you decided to take the choke off of the carburetor before you removed the carburetor from the bike, get a magnetic screwdriver. That's what it's going to take, because you're gonna have to poke those screws down into some pretty teeny tiny holes. In the meantime, I'm lubricating the O-ring on the auto choke using some 2-stroke oil before I insert it into the carb body, and then I'm going to fit this clip here. And once the clip's fitted, I'm going to fit the screws into the clip. So I'll mount the screw inside of a screwdriver or onto a screwdriver, and then I will poke it through. This screwdriver is just barely magnetic, so I'm going to struggle a teeny tiny bit here. But once I have it started, it's pretty easy to get it run through and tighten down. We're nearing the end of this video, so the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the carburetor again. We're going to go over some of the parts that can be seen from the outside of the carburetor, and I'm going to label them. Hopefully that helps you get your carburetor apart and back together. Hopefully this video helped you get your carburetor apart and back together. All of this assumes that you have removed your carburetor by yourself, and you just need some help taking it apart and putting it back together again. That's all this video is meant to do. So with that in mind, let's go over some of the parts attached to the carburetor again. So here's the carburetor, all the way assembled, fresh out of the box. This little brass thing here, that's the oil pump orifice. That's where your oil pump outlet goes. This that my finger is touching, that's the throttle cable elbow. This is the intake side of the carburetor, i.e. the airbox side. And now I'm playing with the idle screw with my index finger and thumb. That's the choke mechanism that I just tapped. There's the idle screw again with my thumb, and now with my index finger, the air fuel mixture screw. So you will want to adjust that once you have the bike idling. And then that's the fuel line orifice. And over here, that's the vacuum line orifice. So vacuum line orifice right here, fuel line orifice over there. That's where your fuel line goes. That's where your vacuum line goes. And that's where your fuel line goes. And that right there on my thumb, that's your oil pump orifice. That's the choke again. It's a very simple carburetor. There's not a whole lot to it. So hopefully that helped. Now go reinstall the thing on your bike. Thanks for watching.